Story 1, The Hollow Ridge, Campsite. I grew up hunting in the Blue Ridge, and most of my memories out there are quiet ones. Long hikes through damp, leaf-covered hollows, crisp mornings where the fog clung to the ground, evenings where the forest seemed to breathe along with you. But there's one trip that never leaves me, no matter how many seasons have come and gone since. I can still smell the damp ash of that campfire, still hear the sound of something moving through the trees, circling. That ridge has stayed in my head like a wound that never healed right. It was late October, years back, and a friend of mine, Evan, wanted to try a new spot he'd heard about. He said there was good deer sign up near Hollow Ridge, a stretch of mountain where the sound carries strange, like voices slipping through a cave. Folks in town always said it was bad ground for camping. Too many steep slopes, too much rock underneath. But Evan was stubborn and I went along because back then I'd go anywhere the woods would take me. We hiked in by noon, set up camp before dark. The ridge sat high, with one side sloping sharp into a hollow that swallowed sound whole. You could drop a rock and it seemed to fall forever. The other side was all tangled oak and pine, thick enough to make you feel closed in. We lit a fire just as the last streaks of daylight bled out. The woods went quiet, the way they always do when night comes on, but it felt heavier up there, like something was pressing down over us. At first, it was just the crackle of the fire and the two of us talking low. Then, as the flames sank into embers, we heard it. Branches snapping. Not far off, not random either. It started on one side of camp, then shifted to the other, slow and steady. We figured it was a deer circling the scent, maybe a bear testing the edge of the light. But the longer it went on, the more it felt wrong. Deer don't circle. Bears make noise, huffing or pawing at logs. This sounded like someone walking, heavy enough to crack wood, light enough to stay hidden. I tried to laugh it off, said maybe another hunter stumbled on us. But the fire was low, and out of the corner of my eye I caught it, a shadow moving between the trees, tall, deliberate, not the twitch of an animal. It paused, then slipped from one trunk to the next, just at the edge of the light. My throat went dry. Evan saw it too. He whispered, "You see that?" We both called out, "Hey, who's there?" But nothing answered. The shadow didn't move again, and the forest went back to silence. We stoked the fire higher, tried to shake it off, but neither of us felt right. Every crack in the dark felt aimed at us. By the time we crawled into the tent, I don't think either of us believed it was an animal anymore. I laid there with my rifle across my chest, listening hard. That's when it started again. Soft at first, then clear as day. Something dragging along the nylon wall of the tent. Not a paw or claw, but something steady, like a finger tracing slow circles. It moved all around us, circling, brushing the fabric with a patience that turned my stomach. Evan mouthed, "What the hell is that?" But neither of us dared to move. The dragging went on for what felt like hours, stopping, starting again on the other side. I gripped my rifle so tight my hands ached, waiting for the tent to tear open. But it never did. Eventually, the sound just stopped. No footsteps walking away, no rustling in the brush, only silence so thick it rang in my ears. We didn't sleep. We just lay there, waiting for dawn like men waiting for a verdict. When light finally broke through, we stumbled out, expecting to find tracks, prints, anything to explain what had circled us. But there was nothing. The ground was soft with leaves, damp from the night, and not a single print. No broken branches, no scuff marks. It was as if no one, or nothing, had ever been there. Evan tried to laugh it off, said maybe the wind dragged the branches against the tent, but he wouldn't look me in the eye when he said it, and we both knew better. The nylon had been pressed in, traced around, like someone studying us through the fabric. Wind doesn't do that. We packed up fast and left the ridge that morning. Neither of us said much on the hike out. The woods looked the same as they always did. Sunlight breaking through the trees, birds calling, but it all felt hollow, like a stage set up over something deeper and darker. I've hunted plenty since then, but never near Hollow Ridge again. I won't even drive past it. Every fall, when the air gets that sharp bite and the leaves start to turn, I think back to that night. The shadow slipping between the trees, the sound of something circling, the slow drag against the tent, and the way the ground held no trace of any of it come morning. I don't know what we saw or who was out there. Maybe it was just some drifter messing with us. Maybe some trick of sound the ridge played on tired minds. But there's one thing I can't shake. Whoever, whatever it was, it never left. It didn't wander off into the dark. It just stopped, like it decided it had learned enough. And I've carried that with me ever since. The feeling that something out there still knows me, still remembers where I sleep when I'm in the woods. Story 2. Footsteps on the game trail. It was my second day out deep in the Blue Ridge, and I'd started before first light. The air was sharp, my breath white against the dark, and frost cracked under every step I took. Hunting had always been something that grounded me, but that morning the woods felt different, like they were holding their breath. Normally, there's some kind of sound, even if it's just a woodpecker or a squirrel crashing through leaves. That morning, though, it was nothing. No birds, no wind, just the hollow crunch of my boots on the frozen trail. I followed a narrow game path, winding through the trees, hoping to find fresh sign. It wasn't long before I got the sense I wasn't alone. At first it was so faint I thought I imagined it. The soft snap of leaves behind me, spaced just right, like footsteps matching mine. I stopped. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just echo, or maybe the woods carrying sound funny. But when I moved again, it was there. A beat behind me, too steady to ignore. I spun around quick, rifle ready. Nothing, just the same wall of trees, bare branches rattling with frost. My chest was tight, but I kept moving, faster this time. The steps quickened too, trailing right behind, never closer, never farther. I tried calling out, my voice breaking the silence like a crack of gunfire. Hello? Anybody out there? No answer. The woods swallowed my words whole, leaving me with that same emptiness pressing down on me. By the time I reached a small clearing, the feeling had my nerves raw. I turned in a full circle, scanning the trees, finger tight on the trigger. Nothing moved. No figure stepped out. No deer bounded off. The silence pressed harder, and for the first time in years of hunting, I felt like prey. I decided to cut the trip short. Better to get back to camp and shake it off than chase shadows. But as I left the trail, cutting through brush to make a quicker line back, the sound followed me. Not constant now, but every so often. 3 steps, a pause, then again. It was enough to make my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it had to be another hunter, someone too nervous or too stubborn to answer back. But the longer it went on, the less I believed it. I crossed through thicker woods, places where underbrush should have snapped and tangled underfoot, but behind me it was always the same. Quiet, deliberate steps that match mine like an echo too close. At one point I stopped dead, forcing myself to listen. For a full minute I heard nothing. Then, just as I started forward again, there it was. 1 step, 2, 3. I picked up my pace. The ridge dipped into a hollow, and the shadows grew longer, darker, though the sun was still up. My mouth was dry, every sound from my own boots grating like thunder. I didn't look back anymore. Didn't want to. It was close to an hour before I made it back to camp. When I broke into the clearing, the silence finally lifted. replaced by the usual forest sounds. The wind picking up, a crow calling in the distance. It almost felt normal again. Almost. I sat by the fire I'd left smouldering, clutching my rifle, trying to calm down. But even there in the open, I couldn't shake the sense that someone had followed me all the way out and was just standing back, waiting. That night I didn't sleep much. Every pop of the fire made me jump. Every shift of the wind sounded like someone stepping just beyond the dark. I kept the rifle across my lap until the first grey of dawn broke. When I finally packed up and left, I didn't bother with the trail. I cut straight down the mountain, moving fast, barely looking back. I've hunted plenty of places since, but I never went back to that ridge. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still hear it. Those steps, steady and patient, a beat behind mine. And the part that unsettles me most isn't what I saw, because I never saw a thing. It's what I didn't. Something was there, close enough to match my every move, close enough to hear me call out, and yet it never showed itself. It just followed, like it was waiting for something. Maybe still is. Story 3, The Shattered Watchtower. We stumbled across the old fire watchtower by pure chance, winding through a ridge I thought I knew well. The structure was half collapsed, leaning crookedly at the edge of a clearing where the trees thinned and the mountains opened up into long, rolling valleys. The wood was grey and splintered, the kind of decay that makes you wonder if it might give way under your weight. My buddy Carl shrugged and dared me to climb it. Curiosity always gets the better of you in the mountains, especially when the air is crisp and the sun is starting its descent. I found what was left of the rickety stairs, each step groaning underfoot, and I climbed, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut that told me this wasn't a good idea. From the top the view was breathtaking, mountains stretched for miles, the fading light tinting the pines in a pale gold, rivers like silver threads cutting through the ridges below. But as I looked down into the woods I felt it, the stillness, not the quiet of dusk or the calm that comes with high elevation, but a wrongness. The trees weren't moving as they should. No wind rustled the leaves. No bird cried out. Just a static, unbroken silence that pressed into my ears and made the hair on my arms stand up. I called to Carl, who was below, shaking his head, trying to wave off my unease. But I couldn't shake it. We set up camp near the clearing that night, thinking the ridge's openness would keep us safe. The fire we built crackled and spit sparks, the only sound besides our low conversation. Hours later, I woke suddenly, my heart hammering. Something was off. A faint clang of metal echoed through the trees just once, then again, slower this time. I froze, straining to listen, the sound bouncing off the slopes in a way that made my head spin. Then, through the thin nylon of the tent, I saw it, the tower, faintly lit at the top. Not the reflection of our campfire, not the moon. It was a soft, flickering light, like a lantern someone had placed there. My mouth went dry. There shouldn't have been anyone for miles. We were the only hunters on this ridge, or at least we thought so. I nudged Carl awake, whispered what I'd seen. He laughed it off, said it was probably a reflection from the fire, or maybe a trick of the eye. But we both knew better. The light didn't behave like firelight. It stayed where it was, dim and deliberate. Every now and then, it flickered, as if adjusting, watching. I wanted to grab my rifle and run, but a part of me was paralyzed, torn between the urge to flee and the compulsion to see who or what was up there. The night stretched long, and the forest around us refused to resume its normal rhythms. No owl hoots, no rustle of squirrels, not even the sigh of wind through the pine needles. Every crack from the dying fire made me flinch. I kept glancing at the tower, half expecting the light to vanish, but it stayed, stubborn, watching. And then, "Went out," just for a moment, and I swore I saw movement. A shadow, sliding down from the top. Careful, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing until it disappeared into the woods below. Morning never came soon enough. When the first pale light bled into the clearing, I grabbed my pack and we walked over to the tower. The light was gone. The metal frame groaned in the wind, cold and silent, untouched. But in the dirt at its base were boot prints, fresh, unmistakable. They led toward the trees and stopped mid-step, like the person had vanished. I stared at them for a long time, heart racing, unable to find a rational explanation. Carl shuffled his feet nervously, avoiding my gaze. We packed up quickly, both of us unnerved, and hiked down the ridge in silence. The forest felt lighter, but only marginally, as if it were holding its breath for something still. I couldn't shake the image of that light at the top of the tower, the deliberate movement, the prints that ended as abruptly as they appeared. Every ridge we crossed, every clearing we passed afterward, seemed haunted by the memory. Years have passed since then, but I still think about that night. I've hunted other ridges, other mountains, and nothing has felt like that. The stillness, the light, the prints, they linger in my mind. Sometimes, when the wind dies down in the trees near my home, I swear I hear the faint echo of metal clanging, distant, deliberate. And I remember the tower, standing crooked on its ridge, the forest around it too quiet to be natural, and I feel the same unease. I've never returned to that clearing. I can't, not with the memory of the prints and the light burned into my mind. There's a part of me that wonders if someone, or something, was watching us, just beyond the trees, patient, silent, waiting to see what we would do. And maybe, even now, it remembers. Maybe that ridge still holds the echo of our footsteps, and that light, and whoever, or whatever, left the prints that disappeared mid-step is still up there, somewhere, keeping its quiet vigil over a forest that doesn't belong to any of us. Tell people it was just a trick of the mind, or maybe an old lantern left by a ranger long gone. But I know better. I can feel it, deep in my chest, every time I think about that ridge. The forest has a memory, and some things in it never truly leave. Story 4. Whistling through the pines. We stumbled across the old fire watchtower by pure chance, winding through a ridge I thought I knew well. The structure was half collapsed, leaning crookedly at the edge of a clearing where the trees thinned and the mountains opened up into long, rolling valleys. The wood was grey and splintered, the kind of decay that makes you wonder if it might give way under your weight. My buddy Carl shrugged and dared me to climb it. Curiosity always gets the better of you in the mountains, especially when the air is crisp and the sun is starting its descent. I found what was left of the rickety stairs, each step groaning underfoot, and I climbed, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut that told me this wasn't a good idea. From the top, the view was breathtaking. Mountains stretched for miles, the fading light tinting the pines in a pale gold, rivers like silver threads cutting through the ridges below. But as I looked down into the woods, I felt it. The stillness, not the quiet of dusk or the calm that comes with high elevation, but a wrongness. The trees weren't moving as they should. No wind rustled the leaves. No bird cried out. Just a static, unbroken silence that pressed into my ears and made the hair on my arms stand up. I called to Carl, who was below, shaking his head, trying to wave off my unease. But I couldn't shake it. We set up camp near the clearing that night, thinking the ridge's openness would keep us safe. The fire we built crackled and spit sparks, the only sound besides our low conversation. Hours later, I woke suddenly, my heart hammering. Something was off. A faint clang of metal echoed through the trees, just once, then again, slower this time. I froze, straining to listen, the sound bouncing off the slopes in a way that made my head spin. Then, through the thin nylon of the tent, I saw it. The tower, faintly lit at the top. Not the reflection of our campfire, not the moon. It was a soft, flickering light, like a lantern someone had placed there. My mouth went dry. There shouldn't have been anyone for miles. We were the only hunters on this ridge, or at least we thought so. I nudged Carl awake, whispered what I'd seen. He laughed it off, said it was probably a reflection from the fire or maybe a trick of the eye, but we both knew better. The light didn't behave like firelight. It stayed where it was, dim and deliberate. Every now and then, it flickered as if adjusting, watching. I wanted to grab my rifle and run, but a part of me was paralyzed, torn between the urge to flee and the compulsion to see who or what was up there. The night stretched long, and the forest around us refused to resume its normal rhythms. No owl hoots, no rustle of squirrels, not even the sigh of wind through the pine needles. Every crack from the dying fire made me flinch. I kept glancing at the tower, half expecting the light to vanish, but it stayed, stubborn, watching. And then it went out just for a moment, and I swore I saw movement. A shadow, sliding down from the top, careful, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, until it disappeared into the woods below. Morning never came soon enough. When the first pale light bled into the clearing, I grabbed my pack and we walked over to the tower. The light was gone. The metal frame groaned in the wind, cold and silent, untouched. But in the dirt at its base were boot prints, fresh, unmistakable. They led toward the trees and stopped mid-step, like the person had vanished. I stared at them for a long time, heart racing, unable to find a rational explanation. Carl shuffled his feet nervously, avoiding my gaze. We packed up quickly, both of us unnerved, and hiked down the ridge in silence. The forest felt lighter, but only marginally, as if it were holding its breath for something still. I couldn't shake the image of that light at the top of the tower, the deliberate movement, the prints that ended as abruptly as they appeared. Every ridge we crossed, every clearing we passed afterward, seemed haunted by the memory. Years have passed since then, but I still think about that night. I've hunted other ridges, other mountains, and nothing has felt like that. The stillness, the light, the prints, they linger in my mind. Sometimes, when the wind dies down in the trees near my home, I swear I hear the faint echo of metal clanging, distant, deliberate. And I remember the tower, standing crooked on its ridge, the forest around it too quiet to be natural, and I feel the same unease. I've never returned to that clearing. I can't, not with the memory of the prints and the light burned into my mind. There's a part of me that wonders if someone or something was watching us just beyond the trees, patient, silent, waiting to see what we would do, and maybe even now it remembers. Maybe that ridge still holds the echo of our footsteps, and that light, and whoever or whatever left the prints that disappeared mid-step is still up there, somewhere, keeping its quiet vigil over a forest that doesn't belong to any of us. I tell people it was just a trick of the mind, or maybe an old lantern left by a ranger long gone. But I know better. I can feel it deep in my chest every time I think about that ridge. The forest has a memory, and some things in it never truly leave. Story 5. Campfire Faces in the Dark. We were 3 hunters that night, sitting close to a fire we'd built on a small clearing deep in the Blue Ridge. The air was crisp, smelling of damp pine needles and smoke, and the sky above had settled into a deep, bruised blue as the sun vanished behind the ridges. Carl and I were swapping stories, the kind that always get a little taller as the night deepens, when I noticed the woods beyond the firelight seemed too still. Normally, there's the occasional rustle, squirrels, wind through the branches, but this time it was almost as if the forest itself were holding its breath. waiting. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, past the flames, I caught movement. 2 figures standing among the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were still at first, but their presence was undeniable. I froze, a creeping chill running down my spine, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the firelight dancing on the shadows. But when I blinked, they were still there, unmoving, just watching. Their faces were pale, expressionless, as though carved from bone and left out in the frost. I couldn't look away. Carl and the third guy, Mike, both noticed them too. Carl squinted, muttering something about another hunter, but it didn't make sense. We were far out, too isolated for anyone else to be camped near us without us noticing. I raised my voice, calling out, "Hey, who's there?" The forest swallowed my words. No response. Not a rustle, not a step. The figures didn't shift, didn't move. They just stood there, patient, silent, like they'd been waiting for hours. The fire crackled between us and them, throwing sparks that illuminated their forms in fleeting glimpses. Each time a spark leapt, I saw the same hollow, unblinking faces staring at us. It was unnatural, not human, or not fully. I swallowed hard, the smoke burning my throat, and motioned for the guys to stay quiet. We just watched each other across the clearing, the tension hanging thick enough to taste. Time stretched and warped. Moments felt like hours. The forest seemed impossibly still, pressing in, a living thing holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, the figures moved, but only slightly, as if they had finally decided we were unworthy of attention. They stepped back slowly, retreating into the dark of the pines until they vanished entirely. And then, silence. Absolute silence. The kind that makes your ears ring, makes you question what you just saw. Carl whispered, voice barely audible. Did that just happen? Mike shook his head, pale, refusing to meet our eyes. I didn't respond. I couldn't. None of us slept that night. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of the wind through the trees made us jump. Every shadow seemed alive, waiting to step out into the firelight. I tried to convince myself it had been someone else, another hunter, perhaps a local passing through, but there were no footprints, no disturbed brush, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. It was as if the figures had been placed there for our eyes only, and then simply melted back into the darkness. Morning didn't feel like relief. It felt like leaving a room after something terrible had passed, but you're not sure what it was. We searched the clearing, the surrounding woods, the paths we'd taken to get there. There was nothing, not a trace. The forest had erased every sign of the watchers, and yet I could still feel them, as if the memory of their presence had settled in the pine needles, in the air we breathed, lingering behind us as we packed up. We left fast, sticking to the main trail and talking as little as possible, not because we were scared of anyone, but because we couldn't put words to it. Carl tried to laugh it off later, joking about seeing the ghost of old mountain folk, but the joke sounded hollow, even to him. Mike didn't speak at all until we reached the edge of the woods. I could tell none of us wanted to look back. Even now, years later, I think about that night every fall when the wind dies down and the world seems quiet in a way that doesn't feel right. I remember the pale, still faces and the feeling of being observed without any explanation. I can feel it sometimes in the corner of my mind, like a weight on my chest. Were they people? Feral mountain dwellers? Something else? I still don't know. But one thing is certain. They were watching us. Not just that night, not just in that clearing, but in a way that left their mark on me. Quiet and insistent, impossible to shake. I've returned to the Blue Ridge many times, hunted many ridges and hollows, but I've never gone near that clearing again. There's a memory there that doesn't belong to me. something that waits in the trees for anyone foolish enough to sit alone by a fire and stare too long into the dark. Sometimes, late at night, I close my eyes and swear I can see them again, just past the firelight, faces pale and expressionless, waiting, and the forest seems just a little too quiet, holding its breath, as if it remembers them too. Story 6, The Lantern on the Creek. I'd been tracking along the creek all afternoon, the kind of slow, methodical hunting where the forest's rhythm almost becomes your own heartbeat. The pine-scented air was thick and still, the kind that presses down on your chest if you're not careful. I kept my rifle slung over my shoulder, eyes scanning for the smallest movement. A squirrel, a deer, anything that would break the monotony of the dimming woods. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridges, turning the water into streaks of copper and shadow, I knew I'd lingered too long. The deep hollows along the creek whispered in the wind, and I could swear I heard twigs snapping behind me more than once. Though when I turned, nothing stirred. As the light waned, I spotted it, a lantern, swinging gently from one side of the creek to the other, its glow faint but steady, as if someone was holding it out ahead, guiding me somewhere. My first thought was a hunter returning to a camp I hadn't realized was nearby. I called out, but my voice sounded swallowed by the trees, the echo fading into the hush of dusk. Still, the lantern bobbed along, maintaining its distance, almost deliberately. I started moving faster, following it through the tangle of undergrowth, stepping carefully over roots slick with moss. My boots sunk slightly into the damp earth, and each squelch sounded deafening in the quiet. No matter how quickly I pressed forward, the lantern seemed to maintain its pace, just ahead of me, winding along the creek as if the current itself carried it. It never brightened, never hesitated. I began to feel uneasy, a creeping tightness in my chest, a sense that the forest wasn't quite right. The birds had gone silent, and the normal rustle of small animals seemed to vanish with them. My skin prickled as I realized I wasn't following another hunter. I was following something that didn't belong to the patterns I knew. My breathing quickened, but I told myself it was just nerves, that I'd probably spooked someone else camping along the creek. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes tracking me, the shadows between the trees feeling far too deep, too deliberate. The lantern finally stopped at a bend where the creek widened and the pines thinned just enough for the last light of day to catch the water. Relief washed over me, but only briefly. I stepped forward, hoping to reach the source, to see another person, to finally confirm the mundane explanation. But when I arrived, there was nothing. No lantern, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The creek bed was empty, smooth and undisturbed, as if it had never been walked. I crouched down, pressed my hand into the dirt and mud, searching for some hint. Anything to prove I hadn't imagined it, but there was nothing. The faint glow had vanished completely, leaving only the deepening shadows and the whisper of water over stones. I stayed there a moment, longer, trying to tell myself it was a trick of my eyes, a reflection of the sun fading behind the mountains, but the sense of being watched remained. The hairs on my neck and forearms stood stiff, the forest now oppressive and close. I finally turned, taking the creek path back toward where I'd parked my truck. Darkness swallowed me quickly, and even with my headlamp on, the forest felt alien. Every snapped twig, every brush of wind against my jacket sounded like footsteps just beyond my vision. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to keep moving steadily, but the unease pressed in, a cold weight in my chest. I felt it most when the creek narrowed again, hemmed in by thick, gnarled roots. Something seemed to cling to the banks, unseen but present. I caught glimpses of movement, shadows shifting just outside my peripheral vision, But each time I turned, there was nothing. The forest had gone silent except for the water, but the silence was different now. Unnatural. Almost waiting. My foot hit a root and I stumbled, catching myself on the mud-soaked bank. I whispered a curse, trying to laugh it off, but the sound of my own voice felt strange, too loud and too vulnerable. About halfway back to my truck, I started to hear it. The faintest hint of a light again. It wasn't a glow this time, not a lantern swinging gently. It was a flicker, a pinprick of amber, almost like firelight, caught through a dense screen of trees. My heart thumped, and I froze, unsure if I wanted to investigate or run. The flicker didn't advance, didn't change. It remained in place, teasing the edges of my sight. I remembered the emptiness where the lantern had disappeared, and something deep in me refused to go closer. I broke into a cautious jog, staying low, careful not to announce myself, and the light followed. Or perhaps it was never moving at all, and I was imagining it. The thought that I might be losing my mind kept pace with the tightening panic in my chest. By the time I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, my heart was pounding hard enough I thought it might burst. The lantern, or whatever it had been, vanished the moment I closed the door, the headlights cutting through the dark like knives. I sat there a moment, gripping the wheel, chest heaving, and listened. There was no sound except the water far behind me, the occasional rustle of wind in the pines. I wanted to tell myself it was over, that the forest had simply played a trick on a tired hunter, but the unease lingered. The feeling of eyes on me, of being led somewhere unseen, didn't fade. I left the mountains that night, driving with every sense alert, checking mirrors for anything that might follow, listening to the hum of the engine like it was my only protection. Sleep was fitful and haunted, with glimpses of that small, flickering light hovering over the creek, just out of reach. I never told anyone about it at the time. I didn't want to sound like a fool, but the memory clings, persistent, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The creek has remained off limits for me ever since. Even now, I can't walk past it without that same knot of unease tightening, that feeling of being watched, of someone or something waiting just beyond the trees, patient, deliberate, and entirely unseen. It isn't the lantern itself that haunts me. It's the certainty that it was never meant to be found. That night, the forest kept its secret, and I stumbled across it by accident. The memory lingers, a quiet, pressing dread that I can't explain or rationalize, and I wonder still whether it was another hunter, someone lost, or something that never should have walked among the pines at all. I've told myself over and over that I imagined it, that it was just exhaustion, but the weight of the memory insists otherwise. The creek waits, still and quiet, and I know I'll never go near it again. Some places in the mountains are best left alone, and some lights are never meant to be followed. Story 7, The Cabin That Shouldn't Be There. I'd been hiking the Blue Ridge for most of the morning, the kind of solitude that feels like it presses against your skin, heavy and damp, almost alive. The trail had thinned out, and soon I was picking my way through old deer paths, over fallen logs, under pine boughs so thick the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Somewhere along the ridge, where the air had that sharp, mossy smell, I stumbled across it. A cabin. Not on any map I'd studied, not in any of the old guidebooks or local tales I'd heard. It sat there like it had always been, half swallowed by the forest, its timbers blackened and rotting, vines curling across the walls, as if the woods itself were trying to reclaim it. At first, I thought maybe it was abandoned hunting land, a forgotten property someone had long since left to ruin. But something about the place felt off. I crouched beside a broken window and peered in, The interior was dark, but I could make out a single chair facing the door, its back straight, patient. It gave me a chill I couldn't shake. Who would leave a chair there like that? Waiting? I scanned the rest of the cabin, saw nothing else. No evidence of life, no fireplace embers, nothing but the faint smell of rot and damp wood. My first instinct was to step inside, to investigate, but my gut shouted against it. There was a weight in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. I didn't need to touch anything to know I shouldn't stay. Reluctantly, I moved on, keeping the cabin in my mind's eye as I hiked further along the ridge, eventually setting up camp about a mile down in a small clearing where the pines thinned enough to see the sky. I had my fire going, the familiar smells of smoke and pine needles comforting, the soft crackle easing some of the tension that the cabin had left behind. As dusk bled into night, I listened to the forest, the rustle of animals, the whistle of the wind through the treetops. But a part of me kept returning to that cabin. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the way the chair had sat there, patient, and the way it had seemed expectant. Around midnight, I woke to it. A creak, soft at first, the kind that could have been any old tree limb bending in the wind. But it wasn't the wind. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time, or maybe just louder, like the deliberate, slow rocking of a chair. Back and forth, patient and steady. The sound carried through the trees, threading between trunks and branches, filling the night with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, almost human. My heart hammered, not in fear at first, but in disbelief. How could someone be out there? I'd passed no paths on the way down. I knew these woods well enough to recognize that. I tried to rationalize it. An animal? A tree limb? My mind grasped for explanations, but none fit. The creaking persisted, never fast, never erratic, just slow and precise, like someone or something, rocking in place, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to leave the fire, couldn't bring myself to call out because even though the sound was distant, it felt close, as if it was aware I was listening. I stayed there, torch in hand, watching the blackness beyond the firelight, knowing I wouldn't sleep. The rocking continued through the night. It was a patient, slow sound, but it carved its way into my nerves. I don't remember exactly when dawn came, only that the first pale fingers of light revealed nothing unusual, the forest looking as innocent and familiar as always. But the memory of the cabin lingered in my mind, persistent, gnawing. When I hiked back to where I'd seen it, I expected to find at least some trace, rotting wood, nails, anything, but there was nothing. Just trees, brush, and the faint undergrowth of a ridge that looked like any other. It was gone. I circled the area for hours, half expecting it to reappear if I just waited long enough. But the forest remained still and quiet. No signs of human activity, no footprints, no remnants of a structure. Even the broken window, the chair, the timbers, they were all gone, vanished as though they'd never existed. I wanted to convince myself I'd been dreaming, that the long hike and the heat and the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. The chair, the window, the deliberate, patient air of the place. It wasn't imagination. Not entirely. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At home, in my own bed, I'd wake in the middle of the night with the sensation of someone just beyond the edge of the light, standing, waiting. And when I hiked again, through those familiar woods, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning every shadow, every broken branch, every hollowed-out tree trunk. It was subtle at first, just a chill, a slight tension in my shoulders, but it grew, persistent. The memory of that cabin and the chair settled into my mind like a splinter. Small, but impossible to ignore. I've returned to the Blue Ridge since then, but never to that exact ridge. Never to the point where I saw the cabin. I tell people about it sometimes, but they laugh, thinking it's a trick of light, an old hunting cabin that someone dismantled. Maybe it was, but I still hear that creak sometimes. Not every night, but enough to make me sit straight in bed, listening, knowing that the sound could be anywhere, that patient, deliberate rhythm of something waiting, rocking in place, just out of sight. It wasn't a dream. I know that now. And I don't know what it was. Was it a cabin that exists out of place? A fragment of the forest itself? Or something left behind by people who were never meant to be seen? I don't know. And I don't want to know. What I do know is that if I had stepped closer, if I had crossed that threshold, might have joined that waiting chair, becoming part of the quiet, patient presence that lingers in the Blue Ridge. And that thought keeps me from ever venturing near that ridge again, no matter how familiar the forest, no matter how tempting the solitude. Some places are not meant to be found. Some things are meant only to watch. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of that ridge, the chair, the window, and the slow, steady creak, like the heartbeat of the forest itself, keeping time with something I can't see but know is there, waiting, patient, silent until I wake. And remember, I left it behind. Or maybe it left me behind. Story 8. The silence at Elk Hollow. I remember the first time I went back to Elk Hollow after my father passed. That forest had always been a place of easy comfort, the kind of woods where you could lose yourself and come back feeling part of something older, something steady. But the moment I crossed that ridge this season, I knew something was wrong. The usual chorus of life, the chatter of birds, the rustle of squirrels, the high-pitched buzz of insects, was gone. It wasn't that the sounds were quiet. They were absent. The woods were holding their breath. Every snapping twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot, and even the wind seemed hesitant, pressing against my ears rather than rustling the leaves. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was early in the season, or maybe just the way the hollow lay that morning, but unease settled in my chest like a stone. I set up near the old ridge where my father had taught me to track deer, dragging my pack along a familiar path lined with brambles and moss-covered roots. My movements were careful, almost too deliberate, as though I were afraid of disturbing the quiet that wrapped around me like fog. Dusk came, and still there was nothing. Not a crow, not the distant bark of a fox, not even the whistle of the creek I knew meandered through the lower hollows. I built my small campfire, huddling close to its warmth, listening for the familiar creaks and groans of a living forest. But the silence remained, oppressive and unnatural, pressing against the edges of my mind. Night fell fully, and I crawled into my tent, feeling exposed despite the canvas walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the hollow had always had quiet patches, and that nothing could be here but the wind. Yet, as I lay there, half asleep, I became aware of it, a breathing, slow, deep, steady, coming from just outside my tent. I froze, holding my rifle across my chest, my knuckles white. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if the forest were leaning in to watch. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk passing close, but the sound didn't move the way animal breathing does. It was measured, deliberate. There was patience in it, a waiting that made my stomach churn. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I dared not move, afraid the smallest shift might draw attention. My flashlight sat on the ground, useless in its helplessness. Every snap of a twig, every creak of my own tent, sounded magnified in the suffocating quiet. I whispered my father's name, soft, shaky, hoping it would ground me. Nothing answered. I told myself I would sleep eventually, that my body would betray my fear, but exhaustion didn't come. Instead, I lay rigid, straining my ears against the night, certain I could feel eyes pressing through the canvas, unseen and unblinking. At some point, I must have dozed, because I woke with the sky just lightening over the horizon. The sun burned pale through the mist, revealing the familiar folds of the hollow in soft morning grey. I crawled out of my tent, rifle still clutched, and surveyed the area with a mix of relief and lingering dread. The ground was pristine. No tracks, no bent grass, no snapped branches. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed whatever had been there, leaving no evidence that it had existed at all. I walked the ridge slowly, eyes scanning the brush, the roots, the shallow gullies, hoping to glimpse something, anything, but the hollow remained unnervingly empty. I kept moving, following the old paths my father had taught me, trying to convince myself that fear had exaggerated the night. But even as the light strengthened, the silence persisted. Birds did not sing. Insects did not hum. There was no sound of running water where the creek should have gurgled. It was as if the hollow itself had pressed a hand over its mouth. The familiar landmarks, the places I had camped and hunted for years, felt alien. Shadows fell differently. Trees leaned where they shouldn't. I tried calling out, hollering my father's name into the trees, laughing nervously to break the tension, but my voice returned at me hollow, bouncing off unseen walls of green. By noon I had to leave. Hunger and growing panic drove me down the slopes toward the old logging trail, a place I could at least see signs of human activity. I didn't stop, didn't look back. And yet, even as the hollow faded behind me, I could feel it in my bones. The weight of that silence. My father's stories, the legends of the hollow being a place to respect, not just for hunting, but for survival, all came rushing back. We joked about it in the past, about strange sightings and sounds, about people vanishing in the hollows, but now I knew the stories carried a warning I had never fully understood. I didn't speak of it for weeks, not wanting anyone to think I was losing my mind. But even now, months later, when I close my eyes and picture Elk Hollow, I can feel the absence, the way it swallows sound, the way it waits. I can still hear that steady breathing just beneath the surface of memory, and it makes my skin crawl. I've been back once, from a safe distance, driving along the logging road, catching glimpses through the fog trees. There was nothing to see, of course, only the hollow itself, indifferent and silent, its floor littered with leaves, its canopy a mute witness, but the memory lingers, sharp and unyielding, and I know it wasn't a dream. I've told a few friends, some hunters who know the hollows well, and they nod, uneasy, refusing to meet my eyes. They speak of other quiet patches in the mountains, stretches of forest where life seems to vanish for hours or days, where the air itself feels heavy with waiting. Some call it bad omens, others call it nothing at all. But I know what I heard, felt, and experienced. I know that in Elk Hollow, silence can be alive. It can watch you, hold you, press against your chest until it feels like you might suffocate. And sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I can swear I hear it still. Not in my ears, but behind them, in the spaces where sound should be, but isn't. I haven't returned, and I won't. Not because I can't, but because I don't want to. There are some places in the mountains that don't belong to us, that remember us more than we remember them. Elk Hollow is one of those places. You can wander its ridges and valleys, think you know it, think you are part of it, but it is patient. It waits for those who are too confident, too careless, too human, and when it chooses to show itself, You don't find footprints, or a figure, or even an explanation. You find only emptiness and a breath that doesn't belong to you. A quiet so heavy it presses in, shaping your fear, making you understand that you are never truly alone, even when nothing is there. I can't explain what I saw or heard. Maybe it was some feral person, maybe a trick of the mind, maybe something the forest itself allows for a moment. I'll never know. But I do know this. The hollow is patient and it waits. And the memory of that night is something that sticks, something that follows, something you can't shake. The kind of fear that isn't loud, isn't dramatic, isn't obvious. The kind that seeps into your bones, that leaves you looking over your shoulder years later, remembering the silence that wasn't silent, the breath that wasn't yours, and the knowledge that some parts of the world are best left unexplored.